The garden at Ashworth Park had not been tended in 2 seasons, and it showed. Rose canes arched wild across the gravel paths. The lavender had gone leggy at the borders, and the stone bench beneath the copper beech sat silvered with lichen where no one had thought to wipe it clean. Eleanor Cavendish sat on that bench on a morning in late May, with her father's book of botanical illustrations open across her knees, reading aloud to no one, as she had done every morning since she arrived 3 months prior to serve as companion to Lady Ashworth, the Dowager Viscountess, mother of a man the county had quietly decided was beyond all ordinary repair. She did not know he was there. He stood at the gap in the yew hedge where the kitchen garden met the ornamental walk, his coat buttoned to the throat despite the warmth. His weight settled on his left leg in a way that suggested the right one had been made to carry more than it was designed for. Major Thomas Ashworth, Viscount Ashworth since his elder brother's sudden death the previous autumn, had not spoken more than 40 words to Eleanor in 3 months of shared residence. The servants said he did not sleep. The village said he did not speak. His mother said, to anyone who would listen, that the war had returned him incomplete, and that a suitable marriage would correct whatever the French had failed to finish. Eleanor turned a page. Her father's handwriting filled the margins in faded brown ink, small, cramped letters pressed too close together, and she traced one annotation with her fingertip before she read it aloud, the way she had read to him in his final months, when his eyes could no longer manage the print. Achillea millefolium, she said to the empty path. Common yarrow. Father notes here that it grew so aggressively in his churchyard border that he once accused it of having no manners and even less sense of proportion. She smiled at the page. She did not hear the sound from the hedge. It was not quite a laugh. It was the ghost of one, the first syllable of an exhalation that had forgotten how to complete itself, caught behind his teeth and released through his nose in a single sharp breath that stirred the leaf of the yew beside his hand. He stepped back before she could look up. His boot caught a stone on the path, and he steadied himself against the hedge post. And when she finally raised her head, she saw only the trembling of the branches, where someone had been standing a moment before. If you have ever watched someone remember how to feel something they had locked carefully away, you know already why this morning mattered. Stay close. Eleanor closed the book and held it against her chest with both hands, the leather cover warm from the sun and from her lap. She looked at the gap in the hedge for a long moment. Then she returned to her reading, aloud, to no one. Though the quality of the silence around her had changed in a way she could not yet name, the position had been presented to her as a kindness. The Reverend William Cavendish, Eleanor's father, had served as rector of the village parish for 23 years, and when he died the previous September, he left behind £300 in debts. A daughter of 22, with no brothers and no marriage prospects, and a cottage that belonged to the living and would pass to his replacement within the quarter. Lady Ashworth had sent word through the housekeeper that Miss Cavendish might be engaged as her personal companion at a salary of £18 per annum, with board and a room in the east wing. The phrasing had been precise. The room was on the servants' corridor. The board did not include supper when guests were present. The £18 would be paid quarterly and would be applied first against the outstanding debts her father had left with the village merchants, a fact Lady Ashworth mentioned to Eleanor on the morning of her arrival, with the same pleasant efficiency one might use to explain the schedule of the post. Eleanor had accepted because there was nothing else to accept. She arrived at Ashworth Park in February, with one trunk, her father's botanical book, 2 plain gowns suitable for a clergyman's daughter in half mourning, and a pair of gloves she had mended 3 times at the left thumb. The house was large and cold, and smelled of polish and silence. Lady Ashworth was a tall woman with excellent posture and a face that had been handsome 30 years ago and now served primarily as a vehicle for judgment. She moved through her household the way a general moves through a garrison, with absolute confidence that the ordering of things was both correct and entirely her own to determine. The Major was a shape in the periphery. Eleanor saw him at breakfast, where he sat at the far end of the table and read dispatches from a solicitor in London. She saw him in the corridor outside the library, where he paused and let her pass without speaking. She saw him in the garden, always in the garden, standing or sitting, or simply being still in the overgrown green of it, as though the wildness there did not trouble him the way order did. He did not limp in any pronounced way. He simply favored one side, a careful redistribution of weight that a stranger might not notice, and that Eleanor, who had spent 2 years learning the body's quiet signals while her father's health diminished, noticed on the second day. She had heard Lady Ashworth's verdict on her son's condition delivered in the drawing room to Mrs. Hale, the mother of the young woman the dowager had selected as suitable. "The charity girl manages well enough with the correspondence," Lady Ashworth had said, adjusting the cuff of her sleeve without looking up. "She is quiet, which is all one can ask. I did not engage her for conversation." Eleanor had been standing in the hall with a stack of letters to be franked. She heard every word through the half-open door. The charity girl. The phrase landed in her chest like a coin dropped into still water, sending rings outward through the rest of the day. She did not speak of it. She took the letters to the study and franked them in her careful hand and returned them to the hall table. She ate her supper alone in the small parlor at the back of the house where the fire was never quite large enough. She opened her father's book to the page where he had drawn a tiny face beside the entry. For the common Daisy, a face with crossed eyes and a crooked smile. And she pressed her thumb against the ink until the warmth of her skin seemed to hold his warmth inside it. The garden became the single room in Ashworth Park where Eleanor felt she could breathe without apology. It was not her garden. It was not anyone's garden. Not any longer. The head gardener had left the previous year when the wages fell behind, and the under gardener had been reassigned to the stable, and the beds had been given over to whatever chose to grow. Eleanor began to tend them in the early mornings, before her duties required her inside, not from any instruction, simply because her hands had been trained by her father to do this work, and her hands remembered it when the rest of her did not know what to do with the hours. She weeded the gravel path on her knees in her plainest gown. She cut back the dead rose canes with a pair of kitchen shears borrowed from the cook. She staked the delphiniums that had fallen sideways in the April rains and tied them upright with strips of cloth torn from a petticoat that had already served every other purpose it could serve, and she read aloud from her father's book, because the sound of her own voice naming the plants he had loved was the closest thing she had found to prayer since his funeral. The Major began appearing at the hedge gap 3 days after the Yarrow morning. He did not announce himself. He did not come through the gate. He stood at the gap where the yew had been cut back for the wheelbarrows, and he watched her work. And when she looked up, he looked away. And when she returned to the soil, his gaze came back. She could feel it. She had spent enough time being looked past to know immediately when she was being looked at, and the quality of his attention was different from anything she had met in this house. It was not evaluative. It was not pitying. It was the attention of someone watching a thing they did not expect to see, the way one watches a fox at the edge of a field, holding very still so as not to break the moment. On the 4th morning, he brought a bench. It was the old oak bench from the kitchen garden, heavy and splintered at one end, and he carried it himself down the path and set it 6 feet from where she knelt, with her hands in the soil around the base of a rosemary bush. He did not explain. He set it down with a care that favored his right side, straightened, and looked at her for the first time with his full face turned toward hers. "You will catch cold sitting on the stone," he said. "Use the bench." His voice was lower than she had expected, rougher, as though it had not been used at full volume in a long time. She opened her mouth to tell him she was not cold, that the stone was perfectly adequate, that she did not require furniture carried across the grounds on her account. Her face was warm. Her pulse was audible in her own ears. She could feel the soil drying on her fingers in the space between his sentence and her breath. "Thank you, my lord," she said. He turned and walked back toward the house. His stride was measured, neither fast nor slow, and she watched him go with the rosemary's sharp green scent on her hands, and a feeling in her chest she could not name, and did not attempt to. The next morning she sat on the bench. He stood at the hedge gap. She read aloud from the entry on lavandula angustifolia, and her father's marginal note informed them both that lavender, when crushed between the fingers, smelled like the memory of every grandmother who had ever lived. She heard the breath again from the hedge, that almost sound, that ghost of an exhalation. She did not look up. She smiled at the page and kept reading. And the morning held them both in the green and the quiet, and the careful distance he maintained like a man who knew exactly how close he could stand before something in him would be required to explain itself. On a Thursday in June, Eleanor was in the kitchen garden cutting rosemary for the cook when she heard the crash. Thomas, the garden boy, 9 years old, hired from the village to carry water and sweep the greenhouse floor, had knocked a terracotta pot from the shelf above the potting bench. The pot had belonged to the old head gardener and bore the Ashworth crest pressed into the rim, and it lay in 4 clean pieces on the flagstones, with the soil spreading dark and wet around the shards. The boy stood frozen with his broom in both hands, his face the color of paper. The housekeeper, Mrs. Aldridge, appeared at the greenhouse door within a minute, drawn by the sound, her ring of keys swinging at her waist. Her face was the particular arrangement of disappointment and calculation that preceded a dismissal. "That was the crested pot," Mrs. Aldridge said. "Her ladyship counted them herself last autumn. You will be sent home today." "He did not break it," Eleanor said. She said it before she had decided to say it. She was already stepping forward, already setting down the rosemary, already placing herself between the housekeeper and the boy with an authority she did not possess and had no right to claim. I reached for the shears on the top shelf, and my elbow caught the pot. Thomas was sweeping. He was nowhere near it. Mrs. Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. "Lady Ashworth will expect an account." "Then she shall have mine," Eleanor said. "The pot was my fault." The housekeeper left. The boy stood behind Eleanor with his broom clutched in both fists, and his breath coming in the small, ragged pulls of a child, trying very hard not to cry. Eleanor crouched beside him and placed her hand on the broom handle, gently, the way one places a hand on something breakable. "The pot is only clay," she said quietly. "You are not." She did not know that the library window overlooked the greenhouse. She did not know that the Major had been standing at that window with an unopened letter in his hand, watching the whole of it, the crash and the housekeeper, and the lie that was not a lie, and the woman who had placed herself in front of a child's future with no more hesitation than if she had been stepping out of the rain. She did not see his hand close around the letter. She did not see his face. He saw hers. That was what mattered. Miss Georgiana Hale arrived at Ashworth Park on the last Friday of June, accompanied by her mother and a trunk of gowns that required 2 footmen to carry upstairs. She was 20 years old, fair-haired, accomplished at the pianoforte, and possessed of a dowry of £5,000 and a confidence that had never been tested by any significant disappointment. Lady Ashworth received her in the drawing-room with the silver tea service, and the 2 mothers sat together on the settee and discussed the Major's recovery with the focused optimism of generals reviewing terrain they intended to capture. Eleanor watched the arrival from the window of the East Wing corridor, standing to the side so she would not be visible from the drive. Miss Hale descended from the carriage in a traveling dress of pale blue muslin with a pelisse the color of new cream, and her bonnet ribbons caught the afternoon light. And her gloves were spotless, and her shoes had never been mended. Eleanor looked down at her own hands, the soil beneath her nails from the morning's weeding, the small raw place on her right thumb where the kitchen shears had slipped the previous week. She curled her fingers into her palms and stepped away from the window. She was not invited to tea. She was told, through Mrs. Aldridge, that her meals would be taken in the small parlor for the duration of Miss Hale's visit, and that her services as companion would not be required in the public rooms. "You understand, of course," Mrs. Aldridge said, not unkindly. "It is a matter of precedence." Eleanor understood. She had spent her entire life inside the narrow corridor between understanding and accepting, and she had learned to walk it without brushing the walls. At dinner that evening, which Eleanor did not attend, Miss Hale inquired about the figure she had seen in the garden that afternoon, the woman in the plain gown with the dirt on her hands. "Is that the charity girl your mother mentioned?" Miss Hale asked the question brightly, across the table, with the particular clarity of someone who has never had to consider whether her words might carry beyond the room. The Major, seated at the head of the table, set down his knife. The sound it made against the plate was very small and very precise. "Her name is Miss Cavendish," he said. His voice carried no inflection. He did not look up. He resumed eating with the same measured deliberation he applied to everything, and the conversation moved on to the subject of the new drapes Lady Ashworth had ordered for the morning room. Miss Hale laughed at something her mother said. The Major did not. Eleanor learned of the exchange the following morning from the kitchen maid who had been serving, a girl named Polly, who brought the detail to her like a gift wrapped in brown paper. "He corrected her, miss," Polly said, her eyes bright. "Right there at the table. Her name is Miss Cavendish. Just like that. Cold as anything." Cold. That was the word the household used. Cold and broken and silent and not right. Not right since the war. Eleanor had heard every variation of this verdict in the 3 months since her arrival, spoken in the kitchen and the laundry and the corridor outside the housekeeper's room in the particular hushed tones that servants reserve for the family's private misfortunes. She did not think he was cold. She thought he was something else entirely. Something she recognized from the months of her father's dying, when the grief had been so large and so constant that the body simply stopped performing the small social gestures that proved to the world you were still inside yourself. Smiling, nodding, offering comment on the weather. These were not evidence of feeling. They were evidence of surplus. The leftover energy a person had after the essential work of continuing to exist had been accounted for. When the essential work took everything, the surplus vanished, and the world called it cold. And the world was wrong. The garden mornings continued. The Major appeared at the hedge gap each day at 7:30, and Eleanor read aloud from her father's book, and the distance between them did not change, and did not need to. She read the entry on foxglove, and her father had noted in the margin that it was beautiful and lethal in equal measure, like most things worth growing. She read the entry on Sweet William, and her father had written simply, "My name. My flower." The only immortality a vicar can reasonably expect. She heard the breath from the hedge at that one, and she turned the page quickly because her own eyes had gone bright, and she did not want him to see. On the morning after the foxglove, he spoke. "Your father was a botanist?" She looked up. He had come through the gap and stood on the path, 4 feet from the bench, closer than he had ever been. The morning light caught the side of his face, and she saw for the first time the thin scar that ran from the corner of his left eye into his hair, a pale line against the brown of skin that had spent years under foreign sun. He was a rector, she said. The plants were his consolation. Consolation for what? For everything else. He was quiet for a moment. His hand went to the breast pocket of his coat, and his fingers closed around something small and round beneath the fabric, a gesture so habitual that she suspected he did not know he was making it. He held whatever it was for the space of 3 heartbeats, and then his hand dropped, and he looked at the overgrown beds with an expression she could not read. "My lieutenant kept a compass," he said. "Brass, the size of a watch." He had scratched his mother's initials into the back of it with the point of his penknife because he said a compass that did not know where home was could not be expected to find north. He stopped. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something heavy and specific, a weight he had been carrying without setting down. His name was James Ferris. He was 19. I told him to hold the left flank at Badajoz, and he held it. And when I reached him, the compass was still in his hand, and his hand was still warm. His voice had gone flat, the way a voice goes flat, when it is carrying something heavier than inflection can manage. The scar at his eye was white in the morning light. His fingers released the compass in his pocket and hung at his side, loose, as though they had finished a task they had been performing for a very long time. Eleanor did not speak. She held her father's book in her lap, and she looked at the major's face, and she did not offer comfort, because comfort was not what he needed. What he needed was to have said it, to have given the words to someone who would hold them without flinching, and she could see in the set of his shoulders and the careful stillness of his jaw that he had not said these words to anyone in the 2 years since the siege. The garden was very quiet. A blackbird sang from the copper beech, 3 notes descending, and the sound fell into the silence between them and stayed there. "Eat something," he said abruptly, his voice rough. "You missed breakfast again. I can hear your stomach from the hedge." She had not missed breakfast. She had eaten bread and butter in the small parlor at 6:30, as she always did. Her stomach was perfectly silent. His command had nothing to do with food. She understood this. Her hands understood it before her mind did, her fingers tightening on the book's cover, her pulse climbing in her wrists. "I have eaten, my lord," she said. "Then eat more," he said, and turned, and walked back through the hedge with the same measured stride, and she sat on the bench he had carried for her, and pressed her hand flat against the page where her father had drawn the crossed-eyed daisy, and felt the morning settle around her, like water closing over a dropped stone. If this story has found you on a night when you needed to be reminded that quiet attention matters more than grand gestures, take a moment and leave a word in the comments. These stories grow when you share them. The days sharpened as June turned toward July. Miss Hale played the pianoforte in the drawing room each evening, and the sound carried through the corridors to the small parlor where Eleanor sat with her mending and her father's book, and the particular patience of a woman who has learned to occupy rooms she is not invited to leave. Lady Ashworth arranged a series of small gatherings, dinners of 8 and 10, designed to display Miss Hale to the neighborhood and to display the Major to Miss Hale, and at each of these Eleanor was absent, eating alone, reading alone, invisible by design. The Major attended the dinners because his mother required it. He sat at the head of the table and answered direct questions and contributed nothing voluntary. Miss Hale laughed and played and wore a different gown each evening, and the neighborhood agreed that she was precisely the remedy the broken man required. And Lady Ashworth accepted this consensus as confirmation of a plan she had never doubted. On the evening of the 12th of July, Lady Ashworth held a supper for 20. The families of the county arrived in their carriages, and the drawing-room was lit with more candles than Eleanor had seen since Christmas at the rectory, and the sound of conversation and music rose through the house like heat. Eleanor sat in the small parlor with a cup of cold tea and a candle of her own, and listened to the distance between herself and the life being lived 2 corridors away. She heard the announcement before she understood it. Lady Ashworth's voice, pitched to Carrie, clear as a church bell in the sudden quiet of the drawing-room, reached her through the plaster and the oak, and the long, cold hallway between. It gives me the deepest pleasure to share that my son, Viscount Ashworth, and Miss Georgiana Hale have reached an understanding. The families are united in their joy. Eleanor's hand stopped on the page. The candle guttered and steadied. The applause came through the walls in a muffled wash, like rain heard from inside a closed room, and she sat very still and listened to it the way one listens to a verdict being delivered in a language one did not expect to understand. Her chest tightened. Her breath came shallow and quick, and she pressed her hand flat against the page of the botanical book, as though the paper could anchor her to something solid while the floor of the small parlor shifted beneath her. She did not cry. She had not cried since her father's funeral, and she would not begin now. Not for this. Not for a man who had carried her a bench and corrected her name at dinner, and told her about a dead boy's compass in a garden neither of them owned. She would not cry for the mornings at the hedge, for the breath that was almost a laugh, for the commands that were not commands, for the way his voice had sounded when he said her father's entry on Sweet William aloud under his breath one morning when he thought she could not hear. She closed the book. She placed it on the table beside the cold tea. She folded her hands in her lap and breathed until the breathing was steady, and then she stood and walked to the corridor because there was mending to return to the linen closet, and the mending did not care what had been announced in the drawing-room. She met Mrs. Barrington in the corridor. Mrs. Barrington was the wife of the local magistrate, a woman of 50 with a face made for sympathy and a voice that carried further than she believed. "Oh, the poor charity girl," Mrs. Barrington said to her companion, not seeing Eleanor in the dim passage. "I heard she had ideas above her station. Followed the Major about the garden like a lost creature. Lady Ashworth put a stop to it, of course. One does." Eleanor stopped walking. Her hand was on the wall. The plaster was cool under her fingers. The words landed the way all 3 voicings of that phrase had landed, not as a blow, not as a cut, as something heavier and more patient. A stone placed on a stone placed on a stone, each one the exact weight of being seen and dismissed in the same glance. She did not retreat to the small parlor. She turned and walked toward the drawing-room. She did not know what she intended. She knew only that she had spent 22 years being a woman the world decided not to see, and that she had spent 3 months being quietly and precisely seen by a man the world had decided was broken, and that the announcement she had just heard was not his voice. It was his mother's. The distinction mattered. She had been a rector's daughter long enough to know the difference between a confession and a compulsion. She stood in the doorway of the drawing-room. The light was enormous. The candles, the gowns, the silver, the faces turning, the conversations pausing one by one as the guests registered the plain figure in the half-mourning gown standing where she had not been invited to stand. Lady Ashworth saw her first. The dowager's face went very still, the way a general's face goes still when an unexpected variable appears on the field. "Miss Cavendish," Lady Ashworth said, "you were not expected." "No," Eleanor said, "I was not." The Major was standing by the mantelpiece. His hand was in his breast pocket, closed around the compass. His face was the color of ash. He had not known about the announcement. Eleanor could see this in the set of his mouth and the particular rigidity of his posture, the posture of a man who has just been ambushed in his own drawing room by a campaign he did not authorize. Miss Hale stood beside the pianoforte with a glass of champagne and a smile that had only just begun to falter at the edges. "I came to return the mending," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not, and she pressed them flat against the fabric of her gown to quiet them. "I did not intend to interrupt. I wish Miss Hale every happiness." She looked at the Major. He looked at her. The room held its breath. "You are kind to everyone in this house, my lord," she said quietly, speaking to him alone, though the room could hear every word. "I mistook it for something it was not. The fault is mine." She turned to leave. Her father's book was in the small parlor. Her trunk was in the east wing. Her 300 pounds of debt was still on the ledger. The corridor was dark and long, and she walked into it with her back straight, and her hand still pressed flat against her gown, and the sound of the drawing room closing behind her. She made it 11 steps before she heard his boots on the marble. "Miss Cavendish." His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The corridor was narrow and silent, and his voice filled it the way a bell fills a church. Not with volume, with resonance. She stopped. She did not turn. She heard him take 3 strides and then stop himself precisely, the way a man stops who knows the distance between discretion and declaration, and has just decided which side of the line he is willing to stand on. Eleanor. Her name. Her given name in his voice for the first time, spoken low and deliberate and stripped of every title and every honorific and every formal distance the past 3 months had maintained. She turned. He stood in the corridor with his hand out of his pocket and the brass compass in his open palm. The candlelight from the wall sconce caught the scratched initials on the back of it, the dead boy's mother's letters, and his face was no longer the color of ash. It was the face of a man who had made a decision and intended to walk through the consequences of it the way he had walked through the breach at Badajoz. Forward, without stopping. "Come back into the room," he said. "Please." She looked at the compass in his hand. She looked at his face. She followed him. The drawing room went silent as they entered together. Lady Ashworth rose from the settee. Miss Hale set down her glass. Mrs. Barrington, who had spoken of the charity girl in the corridor not 10 minutes prior, placed her hand at her own throat. The Major walked to the center of the room. He did not rush. His stride was measured and certain, and he favored his right side, and he did not care. And when he reached the place where the light from the chandelier fell brightest, he stopped and turned to face the assembled guests, with Eleanor Cavendish beside him, and his hand, very gently, at her elbow. "Miss Cavendish is to be my wife," he said. 8 words. The room received them the way the ground receives rain after a long, dry season, in silence first, and then in a slow, spreading saturation that changed the color of everything it touched. Lady Ashworth's lips parted. She began to speak, and the sound that came from her was not the polished sentence she had prepared. It was a fragment, a syllable, the beginning of a protest that collapsed against the fact of her son's face, which was calm and clear and fixed on the woman beside him with an expression the room had never seen him wear. "Thomas," Lady Ashworth managed, "you cannot possibly." "It is done," he said. "I have asked, and she has accepted." Eleanor had not accepted. He had not asked. She understood. Standing in the light with his hand at her elbow and the compass still warm from his grip pressed between their arms, that this was both the question and the answer delivered in the same breath. A compressed act of faith that required her to decide right now, in front of every person who had ever called her the charity girl, whether she was willing to be seen. She placed her hand over his. Her fingers were steady now. The room watched. "I have," she said. Miss Hale sat down at the pianoforte bench, very slowly, as though her legs had made the decision before her mind completed the calculation. Her mother reached for her arm. The champagne glass stood untouched on the music stand, catching the light. Mrs. Barrington lowered her hand from her throat. Her face held the particular expression of a woman revising a story she had been telling confidently for months, the expression that lives in the space between certainty and its retraction. Sir Edmund Hale, Georgiana's father, cleared his throat from the far end of the room. "I believe congratulations are in order," he said, his voice level, his eyes moving once to Lady Ashworth, and then away, an acknowledgement that the campaign had ended, and the terms were not negotiable. The dowager sat down. She sat the way a woman sits when the chair she has been assured would hold her has shifted beneath her weight, not falling, settling into a posture she had not prepared for and did not know how to arrange gracefully. Her hands lay flat on her lap. Her rings caught the candlelight. She did not speak again. The Major looked at Eleanor. The scar at the corner of his eye was pale in the chandelier's glow. His face, which the county had called stone, and the servants had called cold, and his mother had called broken, held an expression that was none of these. It was the face of a man who had remembered what his face was for. The room began tentatively to breathe, That autumn, when the first frost silvered the grass at Ashworth Park, the garden had been pruned and staked and replanted with the precision of someone who understood what patience could do when it was given ground to work in. The old bench sat beneath the copper beech where he had placed it in May, weathered now, stained with rain and pollen, and the particular marks of use that accumulate when a piece of furniture becomes the center of something. Eleanor sat on the bench with her father's book open in her lap. The annotations had not changed. The crossed-eyed daisy was still there, and the Yarrow's accusation of poor manners, and the sweet William entry where her father had written his own small bid for immortality. The brass compass sat on the open page, its case tarnished, the scratched initials still legible, resting on a drawing of Calendula officinalis, common marigold, beside which the Reverend Cavendish had written, "Blooms long after everything sensible has stopped." Thomas came through the hedge gap. He carried a cup of tea in one hand and a piece of toast in the other, and he set both on the bench beside her with the same careful efficiency with which he had once set down the bench itself. "Eat," he said. "I have eaten." "Eat more." She looked up at him. His face held something she had learned to read across the long summer of their courtship. The slight give at the corners of his mouth, the softening at the edges of his jaw, the expression the county would eventually stop calling miraculous and start calling ordinary, because it would become the face he wore every day in this garden, in this house, in this life. "You are smiling," she said. "I am not." "You are. I can see it." "Then look away." She did not look away. She took the toast and ate it, and held the tea in both hands, and watched his face arrange itself into the shape it had been refusing for 2 years, the shape it had almost found on a morning in May, when a dead man's yarrow joke reached him through a hedge, the shape it wore now, without apology or explanation, the face of a man who had been told by the world that he was broken and who had discovered, in a garden, in the company of a woman reading aloud from a dead rector's book, that the world's assessment was not the final one. The frost lay white on the lavender she had planted in July. The copper beech dropped a leaf. It landed on the open page beside the compass, and she let it stay. Because some things that arrive unbidden are allowed to remain. Thank you for being here until the end. If Eleanor's story reached you tonight, leave a quiet word. It means more than you know.